2 weeks since Zoran Mandani won his landslide victory against former Governor Cuomo have been busy season for a magazine that's publishing hysterical anti-socialist hit pieces. We've been trying to address and rebut a good bit of it on the show, but honestly, it's been coming in so fast that it is hard to keep track of it all. But we're going to see how much we can cover tonight. So one of my favorite examples appeared in the Wall Street Journal. It's called, and I swear I'm not making this up, "What Soviet Breadlines Vote for Zoran Mandani?" The author, John Katzimatidis, is the owner of 2 grocery store chains, and apparently he's so terrified of competition from the public sector that he's ranting like Glenn Beck on a bad acid trip about Zoran's proposal to build a grand total of 5 municipally owned grocery stores, one each for each of the 5 boroughs, and each located in areas with the fewest and most expensive private options. This is an extraordinarily modest reform proposal. But Katzimatidis calls it radical socialism and says that if it comes to pass, it would collapse, this is a quote, "collapse our food supply, kill private industry, and drag us down a path toward the bread lines of the old Soviet Union." The same analogy was used by Megan McArdle in the Washington Post in a article with, to be fair, the far less insane headline, "Zoran Mandani has a seriously bad idea for grocery stores." In it, McArdle gives us this fun little quip designed to, make the idea sound as extreme as possible. "Forget the old school's communist talk about socializing the means of production. Mandani wants to socialize the means of consumption." It's cute. And we'll get back to the bit about the means of production in a minute, since that's a whole right-wing freak-out in and of itself. But McArdle at least makes more of an effort than Katzimatidis does to make, some kind of rational argument for her position. It's still weird as hell. She assumes, for example, that if the municipal stores sold groceries more cheaply than the private competition, that would lead to hoarding and a black market. But if 5 stores around the city having slightly cheaper prices than the competition was enough to get people buying it all up in bulk to resell like scalpers outside the game, which can't do for long with groceries, they're perishable. Why doesn't that happen every time a new chain opens up that tries to undercut its competitors? On a more basic level, so I wrote an article about this for MSNBC called "The Ridiculous Right-Wing Panic Over Government-Owned Grocery Stores." And one of the things that I pointed out in there is that it's more than a little bit bizarre to treat a small-scale experiment in offering a public option for grocery stores in a few of the most privately underserved areas as a return to the Soviet Union, when this is a country where 17 states have public monopolies on liquor stores. You cannot have a private liquor store in 17 states. One of the editors at the libertarian magazine Reason, Billy Binion, was arguing with me about this point on Twitter. And I'm not sure if we have his tweet, but in any case, Binion says this is a bad analogy. State-run liquor stores came out of prohibition because governments wanted drinking to be more difficult and expensive after alcohol was legalized again. Using that as a model for food is not exactly reassuring. And look, I don't doubt that there's some truth to that in some of those states if we're talking about things that politicians who had supported prohibition in the 20s were saying in the 1930s. But just in terms of basic intellectual hygiene, I think it's a bad sign when you're talking about what people said in the early 1930s, instead of asking why it is that voters and politicians support keeping those state liquor stores right now. One of the states we're talking about is New Hampshire. That's the most libertarian state of the union. It's the live free or die state. They hate taxes. Are we really supposed to believe that voters and politicians in New Hampshire support keeping the state liquor stores because they're neo-prohibitionists who want to discourage drinking? If so, the policy has been a truly spectacular failure. States are clustered together pretty closely in that part of the country, and people from around the region will often drive to New Hampshire just to stock up on cheap liquor at the state liquor stores. Anyone who's ever driven through the state, will likely remember the giant billboards directing people to those stores. I certainly do. In fact, there was an NPR story several years back about how Latter-day bootleggers were sometimes caught buying up hundreds of bottles of cheap New Hampshire liquor to resell in other states. Far from being a hotbed of neo-prohibitionism, New Hampshire keeps its liquor store policy in place precisely because they don't want to raise taxes, and this is an alternative way of bringing in a lot of revenue, a lot of it coming from out of state even. And city-owned grocery stores would be a whole lot more like New Hampshire liquor stores than they would be like Soviet grocery stores. Other than McCardle and Castamatidis, I've never heard anyone suggest that the reason for empty grocery store shelves in the Soviet Union was about the grocery stores per se, rather than the economic system for producing goods, which didn't do a good job of coordinating production priorities with fine-grained consumer preferences in the absence of the feedback loop of price signals, which is why, by the way, even though I really am a radical socialist who wants to socialize the means of production and consumption and all that, I think any plausible form of socialism we know how to design at this stage of history would have to retain market mechanisms at least some parts of the economy, even if it's worker-owned firms. But going back to the main point, the problem with Soviet grocery stores wasn't that the stores themselves weren't able to put in orders and stock shelves. It was a problem about what was actually being produced. Right? So what was or wasn't available for them to order. In fact, I didn't even mention this in the article. I had a reader take me to task for leaving it out. He was right to do it. I really should have mentioned that the United States federal government already operates hundreds of publicly owned grocery stores. They're just not available to civilians. Why military commissary stores can sell groceries, no problem, to soldiers and their families, but the city of New York can't is really beyond me. What the explanation of this is in terms of free market dogma. But who knows? Maybe there is some reason, and the small scale version wouldn't work as well as the large scale Department of Defense version. Fine. Zoron is only even talking about experimenting with 5 of the damn stores. On a scale of the New York City municipal budget, that's barely registers. And if the stores can't break even and they're too much of a drain, they can be closed. So it goes. What I really can't get over, though, is the massive contradiction at the heart of all of this hysteria about the damn grocery stores. If the shelves would be empty because no public employee could ever handle the difficult logistical dance of making grocery store orders, or maybe no public employee of anything except for the Department of Defense, because apparently they can't handle it. But if that's true, right? If these were going to be like Soviet grocery stores with empty shelves, why would anyone shop there? Right? Why wouldn't they just find private stores to shop at? But if no one did shop there, how are we supposed to understand the claim in the Wall Street Journal article that Mandani wants to replace private grocery stores with public ones? Is the problem that any city-owned grocery stores would be horrendously inefficient, right? So they'd be like grocery stores in Leningrad in 1972? Or is the problem that they'd be so wildly successful that every God-fearing bodega owner trying to support their family would be put out of business? I really don't think either of these make a lot of sense, but at the bare minimum, you do have to choose no more than one of those. And a lot of the other criticisms in these articles make about as much sense as those two. So in Reason Magazine, for example, Liz Wolfe has an article with the "You Cannot Make This Shit Up" title, "Socialists Don't Understand Motherhood." And what she's mad about is that Zoron wants the city to offer free childcare to working mothers. Which, what was the gag in The Simpsons where Lisa wants to go on TV, and so, the excuse she makes up is that she's going to deliver a citizen comment opposing Proposition 305, and she doesn't actually know what Proposition 305 is. The guy says, "You're against discount bus passes for war widows?" But let's see if Wolf can make a case that those stupid mooching working mothers shouldn't get daycare for their kids. What's her argument? You ready for it? She says, and I quote, "Mamdani and all others who advocate universal publicly funded childcare mistake the needs that mothers actually have, the things they say they want, the types of childcare arrangements they favor, assuming that all parents want the state to sublimate their roles. Socialists pretend they want to support mothers and motherhood, but they don't understand what type of help mothers need at all, end quote. Wow. What's the evidence for that? Well, wait for it. Here is the beginning of her very next paragraph. She writes, in 2022, the think tank Institute for Family Studies asked mothers of children under 18 what their ideal situation would be in terms of time spent with kids versus working. They found that 42% of mothers wanted to work full-time, 32% had an ideal of part-time work, and 22% would choose no paid work at all. Got that? 74% of mothers and minors say that in their ideal situation, they would be working at least part-time, right? And yeah, look, I know stay-at-home dads exist, extended and or non-traditional family arrangements exist, all that stuff exists, but, living in the real world about this, sounds like most mothers of children under 18 in their ideal situation could benefit with at least some childcare. Only 22% in her own numbers say they'd be full-time stay-at-home moms, even in their ideal situation. And I'm sure a lot, even in that 22%, are not in what they consider to be the ideal situation and do work at least part-time because they can't afford to stay home full-time. So even in that 22%, there are probably a lot of mothers that free childcare would help. But somehow Reason Magazine looks at a poll where 74% of mothers say that even in their ideal situation, they would be working outside of the home at least some of the time, and concludes, okay, let's not give them childcare because clearly they don't want that. What? A little further down, we get this paragraph. An ideal childcare system, writes Ivana Greco, a writer / homeschooler / lawyer by training with 4 kids, takes into account the full range of childcare, including parents, extended family, friends, neighbors. It considers and respects the wishes and needs of individual families. Skipping ahead a little bit, it should allow for flexibility. It's mindful of costs. Mandani's proposal meets 0 out of 4 of Greco's criteria. Socialists in general don't tailor to such criteria, or even necessarily understand it or wish to honor it when crafting plans for universal childcare. And I spent a long time staring at these paragraphs trying to figure out what the accusation even was. Does she think universal child care means like mandatory child care? Like, your child will be ripped from your arms, slapped in handcuffs, and transported to daycare against their will in an NYPD squad car? Or, because let me put your mind at ease here. If you would prefer to leave your kids with their grandparents or your neighbors, Mayor Mandani is not going to fucking stop you. Go right ahead. This is like saying that the existence of the New York Public Library is somehow offensively inattentive to the needs of people who would prefer to shop at Barnes & Noble or borrow books from friends. The point isn't to take away any childcare option that already exists. It's to add one, right, for people who can't afford it. And, or for people who, or would otherwise, be adding to their burdens that, that they have to pay, even if they have nice middle-class jobs, right? It's a huge expense. And then Wolf goes on and on about how amazing it is to be a stay-at-home mom for the next couple of paragraphs. But again, who's stopping you? The fact that municipal childcare would be available if you wanted it no more means you can't stay home with your kids than the public school existing means you're not allowed to homeschool, or public parks with benches where you could sit outdoors for free existing means you aren't allowed to spend every waking moment inside. It's up to you. Then she goes on about collective farms in the Soviet Union, not having private kitchen spaces for individual families, so there was less cooking. Which she seems to be bringing up as a way of talking about how socialists hate families. But, if we are going to talk about housing policies, which would be a different subject, all Zoron has talked about is a rent freeze for already rent-stabilized apartments, which is the kind of thing there's plenty of precedent for in recent New York history. You don't have to go back to Brezhnev. Literally Bill de Blasio did that. And she brings up Sophie Lewis, who's a person who writes books about, abolishing the family as an institution, which I agree is extremely silly. and it's the kind of thing I've been making fun of for years, but also has literally nothing whatsoever to do with Zoran Mandani. Usually when people try to smear him by association with some obscure radical scholar, they at least talk about his dad, Mahmoud Mandani. But as far as I know, he's never even once mentioned this chick. So, how is this relevant? I guess when Zoran himself doesn't give you enough material for your nonsensical red baiting articles, sometimes you just need to improvise. And look, we've been talking about the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Post reason, but I do not want to let our neglect our friends at the National Review. I know we talked about their anti-Zoran articles for the last couple of weeks, so I don't want to devote a lot of time here. But there was one since then called That's Literally Communism. It's just a very brief write-up, but it's a very brief write-up of a video that's been making the rounds and has been making a lot of news. Do we have the clip? So this is, I guess, just to set this up, this is from a YDSA, right? That's the youth branch of DSA. So Young Democratic Socialists of America event in 2021, which sent shockwaves throughout the right. They just couldn't believe they'd found this direct evidence of the horrible things that he wants to do.
And to remember that our agenda is an agenda that must not be dictated by calculus, but by conviction. And what I mean by that is that the many things that we believe, some of them are already popular in this moment right now, right? If we're talking about the cancellation of student debt, if we're talking about Medicare for all, these are issues which have the groundswell of popular support across this country. But then there are also other issues that we firmly believe in, whether it's BDS, right? Or whether it is the end goal of seizing the means of production, where we do not have the same level of support at this very moment. And what I want to say is that it is critical that in the way that we organize, in the way that we set up our work and our priorities, that we do not leave any one issue for the other, that we do not meet a moment and only look at what people are ready for, but that we are doing both of these things in tandem, because it is critical for us to both meet people where they're at and to also organize for what is correct and for what is right, and to ensure that over time we can bring people to that issue.
Truly, CNBC was right, exactly like the Joker. All right, so let's talk about this. There's been a lot of reaction to this all along the lines of, oh my God, I can't believe it. He actually admitted it. He actually, we have him on tape admitting that he wants to socialize the means of production, which is confusing to me because he ran this entire campaign where he constantly called himself a socialist. If you consult a dictionary, a socialist is somebody who wants to socialize the means of production. That's what the word means. It should be exactly as shocking as somebody who calls himself a libertarian, advocating, liberty against economic redistribution, or somebody who calls himself a conservative wanting to conserve the status quo. And this is, I think this is particularly odd to me, because what it really shows is that a lot of the people who've been leading the freak out about this really are unaware of very, very basic things about the history of the left and really just the history of politics in other Western countries. So in the UK, for example, one of the two main political parties for a very long time has been the Labour Party. From the time that the Labour Party was founded right up until the 1990s, Clause 4 of the party's constitution committed the party to, and I quote, secure for the workers by hand or by brain the full fruits of their industry and the most equitable distribution thereof that may be possible upon the basis of the common ownership of the means of production, distribution, and exchange, and the best obtainable system of popular administration and control of each industry or service. This has been something that many democratic socialist movements that have held state power within capitalist countries around the world have seen as their long-term goal. None of them have made it all the way over that finish line, although, certainly been examples of, certain industries being nationalized, like, healthcare or the coal industry after World War II in the UK. And, most famously, Sweden in the 1970s, teetered on the brink of a more radical break from capitalism with what was called the Meitner Plan, which would have transferred control through stock ownership of big companies, piecemeal to worker-controlled funds. So at the end of the process, you would have had complete worker ownership of major firms in Sweden, and there was a big backlash, and they ended up backing off from that, right? But I mean, this is the kind of thing that's seen that as the end goal is just standard democratic socialist stuff. To the extent that it's not, it's because the global neoliberal turn that led to Clintonism in the United States also led to the watering down of the politics of a lot of these democratic socialist parties in other countries. For example, at the same time that Clinton was turning away from the legacy of the New Deal in the United States, Tony Blair was taking Clause 4 out of the Constitution of the Labour Party in the UK. But certainly over these many decades that the Labour Party was officially committed to the end goal of socializing the means of production. A lot of mayors of cities like London and Manchester who were members of the Labour Party and believed in Clause 4. And trust me, nothing apocalyptic happened in those cities because of that. It was not, in fact, like Bane in the last Christopher Nolan Batman movie. They didn't do show trials. They didn't make anybody walk out onto the ice. And none of that is going to happen if Zoran Mandani becomes the mayor of New York City. Okay, last one is the one that depresses me the most that I want to cover tonight. And that is from somebody who I think should know better than any of the people that we've been talking about, right? So, National Review's get a National Review, right? Reason's going to Reason. Wall Street Journal's going to Wall Street Journal, right? Fish got to swim, birds got to fly, right? This is how the world works. But Matt Taibbi chose to be an idiot. He didn't used to be. He wrote this thing for a Substack called Socialism Wins Its American Normandy, which on the face of it sounds good, sounds positive, right? It's the Normandy landing was a good thing, but I guess he's suggesting that there's a beachhead in a bad direction now that's been achieved. And I do just want to spend a few minutes going through this because I really find this grotesque that he's at least decided to present himself as being as stupid as he's being in this Substack. This is a guy who was a multiple-time guest on the Michael Brooks show back when he used to host a podcast for a Rolling Stone with my friend Katie Halper, right? He clearly did not have an issue with socialists at the time. And in fact, he supported Bernie Sanders' 2 runs for president, right? I mean, he was more moderate than, Michael or Katie was politically, right? I don't think he'd ever called himself a socialist, but the kinds of things he says here, he never would have said. So, started at the beginning. Says New York City's mayoral race has been won by Zoran Mandani, no Bernie Sanders style imitator, but the real thing. Son of a famed socialist scholar and Marvel superhero to every Jackman reading, keffiyeh wearing student activist, huddled in Judean People's Front style confabs between bell hooks readings and visits to mom and dad on the Upper East Side. So we are coming in strong with the cardboard cutout socialist straw men. But we haven't really heard why this is bad yet. Let's keep going. So it says, in a comment-like assent, Mandani has become a bête noire for conservatives, many Jewish New Yorkers, and moderates thanks to a list of controversial statements, including a quasi-defense of the phrase globalize the intifada and fairness after a gotcha question, not signing a state assembly resolution recognizing the Holocaust, and leading efforts to boycott Israel and slow Israeli charities. If that's your thing, feel free to flip out over those, but the true red flag is Mamdani's economic platform. And this, to me, is worth lingering on just for a second, because if anything, this feels like the most dishonest part of the whole thing. So Mamdani is being constantly smeared as being an anti-Semite or a pro-terrorist because he says that he doesn't believe in ethno-states. He thinks every state should be a state based on equal rights, and he's spoken out against the atrocities committed in Gaza by the IDF. Matt Taibbi obviously knows that that's all nonsense. And he can't quite bring himself to repeat it, but he can't bring himself to admit that these are smears either. So he just kind of says, yeah, fine, I don't really care about that. Let's talk about economics. And sure, I'll talk about the economics, but it is extremely gross, and it is worth saying. Let's keep going. So that economic platform, he says, is a yummy poo-poo platter of rent freezes, free bus rides, free childcare, and subsidized city-owned grocery stores. And this is really amazing, because if you remember, again, Matt Taibbi supported both of Bernie's runs for president. Right? This is exactly the kind of thing that Bernie Sanders was running on. Now, maybe there's a sophisticated explanation of why free universal health care is just fine, but free universal child care is, utopian nonsense that could only be advocated by keffiyeh-wearing, Jacobin-reading, student socialists. But he certainly doesn't give us that explanation. Let's keep going. He says that this plan for city-owned grocery stores will clamp down on those evil bodega owners and private supermarkets that force overpriced Fritos and soda on the poor. And he's not even really trying here. Why exactly would it involve clamping down? We don't know, right? I mean, clamping down suggests that the existence of 5 city-owned grocery stores would somehow drive all these bodegas he's worried about out of business. That implies that they would be extremely efficient. And he gives us no reason to think that, at least in the body of the Substack. The next thing he says is that this will be the AOC theory of inflation caused by price gouging deployed in real life. So now he is suggesting that any suggestion that corporate price gouging plays a role in the inflation in the last couple of years is just, again, silly keffiyeh-wearing, Jacobin-reading student socialist stuff. And I have to say, I feel like the Matt Taibbi of just a few years ago would have had a lot of fun skewering anybody who made exactly the same point. In fact, I can imagine the Rolling Stone article where he would have skewered them, where he would have said that this is that, like, he would have made fun of them as McCarthyites. He probably would have quoted some of these earnings calls between CEOs and investors at food companies during the height of inflation discourse, where they were bragging about record profits. But no, at this point, this could have been written for Reason or the National Review. And then, he says, he uses the phrase here, right? This is, right, via a program to reverse ongoing harms of colonialism by liberating humans and non-human food animals from industry-driven food myths that compel us to harm your bodies. And have you stabbed yourself in the face yet? Viva la revolution. At this point, he's just doing anti-communist slam poetry, right? There's no content here. Zoran Mamdani didn't say any of that. This is very, very unlike how Zoran actually speaks. And after this, right? Look at the next thing. The next thing he says: colleges used to subtly pull students back from this ledge before graduation so as not to freak out actual tuition payers. But now the parents are socialists leading here. Anyone tempted to laugh shouldn't. This is the flip side of Trumpism, inevitably, for similar reasons. An absent full catastrophe in coming Mamdani-ruled Gotham. Not impossible. The electoral mainstreaming of dingbat campus socialism has only begun. Many will argue that we saw a movement in Mamdani's direction with the rise of chief backer Bernie Sanders. So this is Taibbi addressing the elephant in the room. How could he reconcile his hysterical red-baiting freakout about Zoran Mandani with his long history of supporting Bernie Sanders, from 2015 to 2020. He says Bernie nearly captured the Democratic nomination in 2020, despite self-identifying as a democratic socialist, unimaginable as recently as the Obama years. While Sanders infamously went on a very strange honeymoon in the Soviet Union and authored books with titles like Our Revolution and It's Okay to Be Angry About Capitalism, his politics by the time he reached Washington were closer to Eisenhower than Marx, as he pushed ideas like an increased minimum wage, single-payer healthcare, and drug reimportation to fit the framework of traditional free market America. Sanders grew up dirt poor in Brooklyn and never lost affection for the party of the New Deal, perhaps to a fault. Loyalty to the DNC and figures like pal Joe Biden being a big reason he never reached the White House. And let's just pause on this for a second, because this is really amazing for a couple of reasons. First of all, this idea that Zoran is unlike Bernie, their politics are different, because Bernie never lost his affection for the Democratic Party, really reveals very basic ignorance about the most elementary facts about Bernie's career. Zoran Mandani has never run on any ballot line except for the Democratic one. When Bernie Sanders first went into politics, first started running for office, he was running as a candidate for the small Socialist Liberty Union Party in Vermont. Before that, he was a member of YPSL, the Young People's Socialist League, the youth wing of the Socialist Party of America. And after his Liberty Union days, he ran as an independent in every race of his lifetime, except for the 2 times that he ran for the Democratic presidential nomination. What really gets me about this, though, is apart from all of that, says Mamdani is different. Right? Born in Uganda to a post-colonial theorist and a future Hollywood director, he's a fancy prep school kid like me, right? So he wants to do the dig, but he also wants to avoid being called on the dig. And a recent immigrant. Not in itself bad. Okay, it certainly sounds like you're making it sound like it's bad, but not in itself bad. But the crises of America's past aren't in his political muscle memory. You'll get a better sense of his beliefs reading father and Columbia professor Mahmoud Mandani's Impenetrable Citizen and Subject than you will watching documentaries about Mario Savo or Woodstock. And to get the full inanity of this, Bernie Sanders' father was a Polish immigrant. Right? Bernie's whole family was wiped out in the Holocaust. He's very recent European roots. His dad was an immigrant from Poland. It's true that Bernie was born here, but then again, it's also true that Zoran was living in the United States by the time he was 7 years old. Does political muscle memory start to form before the age of 7? I'm so curious about how this is supposed to work. But I think the larger point is when he's saying, Bernie is unlike Zoran because Bernie advocated all of these reforms within the free market system, right, within the capitalist system, like single-payer healthcare and a higher minimum wage, whereas Zoran is a crazy socialist. But all the stuff that you just called the yummy poo-poo platter of goodies, right? Those were all reforms within the framework of the capitalist system. Building 5 city-owned grocery stores is not less socialist than nationalizing the entire private insurance industry in the United States. Free childcare is not more socialist than than offering healthcare in that same example to everybody free at the point of service, or making public colleges and universities tuition free, which was also something that Bernie was talking about. Or Bernie wanting to raise the minimum wage is not somehow more Eisenhowerian and less socialist than Zoran Mandani wanting to raise the municipal minimum wage, which is also something that comes up in this article. And I'm not going to go through the rest of it. At a certain point, you almost have to just kind of look away in disgust and stop craning at the car crash. But again, what gets me about this is actually, Matt Taibbi, several years ago, wrote a book called Hate Inc., which was a media critique book. He originally saw it as an update on Noam Chomsky's Manufacturing Consent. By the way, Noam Chomsky, also a socialist, certainly not somehow to the right of Zoran Mandani, but Matt Taibbi admired him greatly back in the day. And in there's a line where he's talking about why one of the media figures on the cover is Rachel Maddow. And, he says that he has a contrast between Rachel Maddow and Sean Hannity, where he says that, okay, Sean Hannity has always been like this. He's just a hack. Whereas, Rachel Maddow was smart. She chose to become a partisan hack. And that passage in Hate Inc. has been going through my head since I saw this Substack. Because, again, Matt Taibbi clearly knew better. Right? He clearly didn't think any of this shit when Bernie Sanders was running for office in 2016 and 2020. And by the way, his own statements back in the Liberty Union days about nationalizing the means of production were routinely brought up by his political opponents to try to discredit him. There are lots of articles like that you can go back and look at. He clearly didn't think any of this stuff when he was hanging out, on the Michael Brooks show. He clearly didn't think any of this stuff while he was co-hosting a show with Katie Alper, for God's sake. And if there's some great political revelation that he's had since then, where there's some actual intellectual nutrition to this shift, it is pretty amazing that he hasn't chosen to share it with us. Instead, he's trying to square the circle and explain why Bernie and Zoran are so different. And honestly, I guess I'll just leave it here. The whole thing just makes me incredibly sad because it is so clearly a choice. And to lightly paraphrase the film Tropic Thunder, you never go full reactionary. And that is what Matt Taibbi seems to have decided to do. You have been watching free public content from Give Them an Argument. To access every single episode of the show, the main show on Monday nights, all of the streams, all of the debate breakdowns, all of the patron-exclusive postgames on Monday nights, all of the patron-exclusive bonus episodes every week, and much, much more, go to patreon.com/Ben Burgis. I cannot resist ending this with, don't be foolish.